All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for a session on shared mobility, freight, and goods delivery. My name is Andy Sheranjvari, and I'm going to be the moderator for this session. We have a fantastic panel today, and I'm so excited to start this discussion. We have representatives from Uber Freight, Bosch eBike Systems, Koloni, and also Seattle Department of Transportation. Before we start, I just want to give a huge shout out to our session organizer, Rudy Foss, and their whole team at Shared Use Mobility Summit for putting this session and the whole virtual summit together, a very impressive effort. So the way it's planned, the way our session is planned is that I'm going to give a little background on the supply chain, freight, and logistics. And then I'm going to ask each of our panelists to say a little bit about themselves, introduce themselves, and tell us what their company, division does. And then we're going to discuss various topics in this field, and then we will take on questions. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of integrating freight with other plans, and also talk about current status of urban freight and supply chain and logistics here. I'm a research engineer at the University of Washington, and I manage the Urban Freight Lab at the Research Center here. My background is mostly in public transportation and shared mobility, but I decided to take a turn and start learning more and working on freight because there is just an ever-increasing need in this field, and there are so many gaps here. So when I look back at my education and my works in multimodal projects, freight was almost always excluded. Like when I look at my graduate studies in transportation engineering, we barely had a course on freight and logistics. Or when I was working in public agencies on modeling work or planning work on transportation projects, we were always treating freight differently. Like everything was run simultaneously, and then there was a separate module for freight, and we were just treating that differently. And it was also for like the belief for many people when they were talking about freight, they were just thinking about these noisy pollutant, like road blocking, dangerous big trucks. But right now, we are living in an era that one way or another, people are all understanding the significance of urban deliveries and supply chain on their day-to-day lives. Whether it's through an Amazon package delivery, it's groceries that you order online, food that you deliver to restaurants, and especially recently with the pandemic, like one of the things that COVID really highlighted for all of us is how much we rely on the supply chain and urban deliveries in our everyday life. And that's maybe an opportunity that it just brought to light how important it is to those people who were not paying attention to supply chain and freight maybe that much before. So, and that's one side of the story, that how the importance of this has been highlighted. The other part of that is just, so we have this rapid growth in e-commerce, in population and the demand, and everything is just going on. But if we continue managing and satisfying the demand in a previous way, we cannot just keep up, because that means having more and more vehicles on our roads. And that's why we already are facing serious congestion issues. We're facing climate issues, and our infrastructure is limited. Like one of the things that you may have heard or have come across these days, and is becoming one of the hot topics in transportation, is curbside management. And it's because there is this growing competition about city curbs between old users like transit, personal vehicles for parkings, and goods delivery, and now a ton of new users like TNCs, like Uber and Lyft, bikes and scooters, and on-demand food and goods delivery. Yet we only have very limited number of curbs in our cities. So we have limited infrastructure. We already have issues with congestion and climate. And yet there is this ever increasing demand for freight and on-demand delivery. So there must be innovations. There must be new ways of management. There must be new data to help understand the behavior and operations. And then there must be collaborations between private sector, public sector, and also research institutions. And that's why in the past couple of years, you see a lot of innovations in this field. You see services like Uber Freight and Uber Eats, you see cargo bikes, you see innovations like lockers and delivery hubs, and you see cities and states taking a more aggressive approach toward including freight in their long-term planning. And that is so exciting. Like the center that I work at University of Washington, the SCTL Center, is devoted to research and education in supply chain, transportation, and logistics. And within that center, we have formed a strategic partnership, really a work group called Urban Freight Lab that it brings together private industry, public agencies, and academia together to solve urban freight problems. So we discuss the challenges together, we identify problems, we develop potential solutions like high impact, low cost solutions. We test them on the ground, and then we come up with guidelines, strategies, and answers. Sometimes it's collecting data to fill the gaps. Sometimes it's developing a methodology to analyze or quantify something. Sometimes it's implementing a change and assessing the impacts of that. Like we have a grant from the Department of Energy to study the ways that we can integrate technology to increase urban delivery efficiency. And for that, we are testing two solutions. One is parcel lockers to allow for increased delivery density. And that is the more number of packages that you can deliver per mile of driving. The other solution is to develop a parking occupancy app for commercial vehicles, because we discovered that it's a huge issue for delivery drivers to find a place that they can park, they can stay there, and they can complete their deliveries. So we are hoping that an occupancy parking app can help them find spots easier throughout the city. And for that project, we're working with the city of Seattle. We're working with our carriers like UPS and USPS. We're working with a bunch of retailers. And really, for all of these projects, it's the collaboration, it's the partnership that makes all of this exciting research for us happen. In another project that we have, we are testing an implementation of a delivery hub to measure the effects of that, both on the operators and also on the local. And delivery hubs are, as the name says, there are locations, there are hubs where large vehicles, large truck delivery vehicles, they don't need to enter the CBD of the cities. They can come to this hub, they can unload, and then the packages can be consolidated, and the last mile of the delivery can be done by lighter, greener delivery vehicles like cargo bikes. And the list goes on and on. I can talk about all of the projects that I'm excited about, but really my point here is that freight word is a very fascinating word, and there's a lot of opportunities to improve and innovate. There's a lot of room to grow, and there's a lot to learn. So, and I have really enjoyed learning about all of these things from different perspectives, private perspectives, public perspectives, and trying to find ways that we can all work together to make a real impact in our cities. And that's one of the reasons that I'm very excited about our panel today, because we have different perspectives. And with that, I just want to introduce our panelists and start the discussion. So we have Samir Dohadwala, Head of Central Operations from Uber Freight. We have Stephen Sheffield, Lead of Product Management and Business Development from Bosch eBike Systems. Brian Dewey, CEO of Koloni, and we have Kelly Rula, New Mobility Lead from New Mobility, Climate and Freight Division at Seattle Department of Transportation. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to tell us a little bit about themselves and then tell us more about what their company or division does. And let's start with Samir.
Okay, thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. So thank you for doing this and setting it up, and thank you all for being here. I know this is a busy time, so it means a lot that you're giving us an hour of your time. So I do lead our central operations org at Uber Freight. I think most of you are familiar with Uber, potentially less so with Uber Freight. It's our newest business line. It's our fastest growing business line. And it's essentially it's a digital freight brokerage. So, we're really aiming to do similarly what we did to rides to the freight industry. Try to disintermediate the marketplace a little bit, add more transparency, more visibility, and just make the experience a little more seamless than what we've traditionally seen in this supply chain. Right now, Uber Freight's primarily focused on anywhere from short to long haul, over the road, dry van, primarily in the US, Canada, and Europe. We do have a presence in a few other spaces like refrigerated, flatbed, and a few other emerging bets. But just so you guys have a sense of kind of where we play right now in Uber Freight. And my team specifically is focused on a number of different elements of building scale and just making sure that we are what I call future-proofing our business. So a couple examples of some of the team I have the pleasure to lead. We focus a lot on tracking and tracing, so making sure we know where our trucks are and how we can understand how we get ahead of defects and issues and all the things that having really perfect GPS visibility allows us to do within the supply chain. We focus a lot on network reliability and service, making sure trucks show up where they're supposed to show up and when they show up. We focus on a number of emerging bets at nodes in the supply chains, and particularly facilities, and what we can do alleviate the burden within the supply chain. And then a lot of broader efficiency scale bets that we focus on where we can take and use our technology to really drive improvements in the overall ecosystem. I also have some experience in different areas of transportation. Prior to this role, I was our general manager overseeing our rides business for our Midwest organization. So was able to oversee our 11 states, 55 cities in the Midwest, Chicago, which is where I'm based, being the biggest city, and learned a lot about that side of at that point. So that's a little bit about me. I'm excited to be here and looking forward to a great discussion.
Wonderful. Next, Stephen.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Stephen Sheffield from Bosch eBike Systems. We manufacture the drive systems and batteries and controllers for various e-bike brands around the world. So we're the global leader in premium e-bike systems. You'll find our products on Trek bikes, Cannondale bikes, but you'll also start to see them more and more on cargo bikes, and that's where we've come together on this, and glad to be part of this group. We've done some research recently on e-bike use in this area and are seeing a strong uptick. And even in the current situation, there's a bit of a bike boom, and we're seeing more and more people using e-bikes to get outside and do errands so that they may have previously done in a vehicle to get some fresh air and time moving. And on the intro slide, you would have seen an image of an e-bike being used for delivery, and we'll get more into that with your questions, but it's been an exciting time for us. We're seeing Amazon developing more programs around e-bike delivery. We've seen Domino's, starting to use e-bikes for pizza delivery. That's with Rad Power, a different brand in this space. But everything from larger trikes to UPS and DHL have been activating, and it's an exciting time. We've also been able to watch Europe quite closely in this space. They seem to be a few years ahead of the North American market in terms of e-bike use, and that goes for freight as well. So like DB Schenker has done lots with e-bikes over there. That's an interesting company to keep an eye on. And yeah, so been involved with eBike for several years now, and we're a growing team here in North America, and looking forward to this discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. Brian, you're next.
Yeah, I keep having audio problems, but we'll see how this goes. My name is Brian Dewey. I'm the CEO of Koloni, and I established a company in 2016. We're a small team of about 15 employees. We initially got into the micromobility space, where we focus on the small, medium-sized markets, offering bike and scooter share programs throughout the country. But over the last 6 to 10 months, we've kind of made a pivot and focused more and more on our locker product, which we identified early in 2019 as being an area that needs to be disrupted. We saw a lot of the same problems that we saw in bike and scooter sharing prior to the dockless model, where lockers tend to be, the current smart lockers that we see tend to be very expensive, taking up significant real estate. The form factor of the lockers make it difficult to design around unique spaces, and then also not having the flexibility to be inside or outside very easily. So we looked at a lot of the things that were solved in the micromobility space, and we saw pretty easily that those things can really move over to the locker space, where we designed a dockless, what we call the dockless smart locker. And our company is really focused on that, where we're not just focused on the sharing aspect of the locker, but also making the locker programmable to accommodate deliveries and also storage applications, and then also the sharing applications as well. We have been deploying those lockers over the last few months. We were actually focusing on that prior to COVID, but over the last few months, we've really seen that some things change, as all of us have, regarding creating more contactless delivery systems, also increasing some efficiencies, reducing the amount of traffic that are going into restaurants and retail stores and things of that nature. So we've really seen a lot. We've really had a lot of interesting discussions in the dockless locker business. But yeah, I'm excited to join this panel and talk about this space more.
Wonderful. And for those of you who may not be very familiar with lockers, Brian has a nice background, so you can see what he's talking about. Yeah, there you go. All right, Kelly.
Hey everyone, happy to be here. Kelly Rula here with Seattle DOT. I lead our new mobility portfolio, which is in our transit and mobility division. And I think, Andisha gave a great overview of the landscape and kind of bringing it all together. You can see how the companies we have on the call today, for example, have made pivots out of the shared mobility model and kind of towards urban freight, or at least opening their arms to urban freight. And so a lot of the work our team does, in addition to managing programs like shared bikes and TNCs and things like that, is looking ahead towards kind of future models and how we can integrate what we've learned from the shared mobility models into the urban freight space or the freight space. So we cover everything from shared mobility to autonomy to kind of data and digitization as well. I think what's interesting, so my background is kind of in blurring of environmental, and then I worked on kind of the launch of Amazon Prime Now, which is ultra fast delivery, and then bringing it into the public sector space. To Andisha's point, I think there's been more recently an awakening of the fact that freight is a really important aspect of the transportation and mobility system, and it's getting more and more attention. And we've been working with the Urban Freight Lab at the University of Washington for the last few years to do some really great, exciting, both research and implementation projects. And so I think that, mirroring these points, it's this collaboration between the three entities of research, academia, private sector, and public sector, where we're really going to start to see these breakthrough innovations. And I think Seattle is lucky enough to have both the headquarters of Amazon, sort of a lot of the birthplace of this growth in e-commerce, as well as this great research institution. And I just wanted to highlight that connection between shared mobility and looking towards urban freight. And we've worked with the Urban Freight Lab. I'll highlight a few other things. We worked with them on a project to study curb around TNCs, because you can't really fully understand the freight space if you don't also understand what's happening in the shared mobility space. We talk a lot about curbs. A lot of that focus is moving towards sidewalks now, with bikes and scooters, and sort of how do we manage the entire public right-of-way space. But thinking more about how do we incorporate freight. And so again, it takes that sort of holistic perspective, and I think Seattle has done a lot of great work, especially our curb team, in not only creating a great foundation in data collection and operationalizing our curb 20 years ago in a way that most cities have unfortunately not been able to do. So we have a great wealth of data. Then we've been partnering with UW to sort of fill in the holes. We did a study on our alleyways, looking at private off-street loading as well to sort of fill in those gaps for us. And then we also recently did a really cool cordon study with the Freight Lab, and that was looking at freight flows into and out of the city. And some interesting findings, as we've been pointing out, freight looks a lot different than maybe people stereotypically think of it. It's not just all 18-wheelers and heavy haul. It's a very diverse makeup now, and that was illustrated in the study. And then something that we won't talk about as much today, but something I've been thinking about more is we also found that service vehicles make up a large portion of that, what we'd kind of consider into that freight or larger movement. So think of your plumber and their Sprinter van, and the HVAC guys and gals. And I think that's another space where, as urban freight's umbrella kind of opens up, we're going to have to also think about, the folks that are really driving in and out of the city and doing maybe longer stops, but still have larger vehicles and things like that. So it's a really exciting space. And again, I think Seattle has a unique positioning to kind of like get to experiment with both the research and the private sector.
Thank you, Kelly. And just to throw some, the academic in me wants to throw some numbers on the things that Kelly just mentioned. Like, for example, for the service vehicles that she mentioned, in our study, we found that really 30% of the vehicles that are usually classified as freight, they are service vehicles, and they are their operation and their characteristics is very different from delivery vehicles, and that's a very common misunderstanding about freight vehicles that can cause some challenges and issues. The other thing is that, as she was talking about large vehicles, one thing that I want to talk about. So it's also about the time they spend being parked at the curb or other places in the city, because that also makes a big difference. Like, it's just this common belief that delivery trucks stay there for a long time. It's not really like that. So we did a holistic study on in the city of Seattle, and we found that most of the delivery vehicles, they stay there between 15 to like 30 minutes, but service vehicles, they stay there between 30 minutes to 1 hour, which is again a big difference in that. All right, so thank you all for the intros. I know that there's a question on everyone's mind about COVID impacts and the responses to that, and we will get to that pretty soon. But just before that, I would like to also ask each of you, and there was also a question in the Q&A about the challenges. I want to ask you to talk about the challenges in your work, and that can be from any perspective: infrastructure, demand and supply, marketing, regulation, the challenges in your work, and also the most exciting or enjoyable things in your work. So if each of you can speak briefly toward that, and that's what I'm talking about is generally not necessarily in the COVID era, but we'll get to that pretty soon. So tell us about the challenges in your work and also the most exciting or enjoyable things. And there was a specific question that I saw about infrastructure challenges for Bosch e-bikes that Stephen, perhaps you can address. Yeah, we can go through the same order, or you can, whoever wants to chime in can start.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think there are a number of challenges and interesting opportunities when you think about the broader freight industry, and I'll try to focus a little bit on what we think about within Uber Freight, which is more like medium, long hauls, into interstate, et cetera. I think the most interesting thing at a broader level that gets me really excited, both from a challenge and an opportunity perspective, is the freight industry is just incredibly fragmented, and there's a lack of communication and transparency within and across. And so that manifests itself in a ton of different ways. So let's say you just need to move something from Chicago to Los Angeles. Now, we might work with a shipper who has a set of very specific technology systems, tools, processes. We work with a carrier or a driver who has a completely different set. We have our own tools. At some point, a driver has to, for whatever reason, we have to go back to the shipper. We have to work with the facility manually. We have to do all of these things. Now that's like the traditional world, right? And if you think about, if you've ever taken an Uber ride, hopefully most of you have, you may have had a situation at some point where a driver cancels their ride. And you may not have even noticed, because it'll cancel and it'll immediately find you somebody else and it'll rebook it. And it's this concept that we have called a self-healing network. And that's really the exciting opportunity that we're trying to drive towards in what I'd call phase one of Uber Freight, which is how do we create more connectivity both on the supply and the demand side within the freight ecosystem, so that if a driver cancels or something happens at a facility, there is fantastic data, transparency, visibility, and an ability to solve that in real time. And there are instances on our platform, for example, where we'll have a driver who breaks down, has a mechanical breakdown on his way to pick up, and within 5 minutes, that load will have been booked by another carrier who has seen it on our app, who picks it up, who goes, and on the back end, all of the relevant data is passed on to the facility, the appointment times changes, all of these elements. And so for me, it's such a stark change from the ride sharing world, which I'm happy to talk about as well. But this idea of really bringing together and connecting the different parts of the broader freight supply chain is just such a huge opportunity and such an interesting opportunity. And we're finally at a point now in the last several years where we have the data and ability to really tackle this in the right way. So I would say I'm happy to talk about a lot of challenges, but that's one that's super exciting to me, and I think a little bit unique to the freight industry.
Stephen, do you want to go next?
Yeah, let me jump in. So just in terms of specific challenges in this situation, the bike industry has definitely been impacted by this, and there was a big drop for the bicycle industry overall in middle of March as all of this came about. In the meantime, we've seen a bit of a bike boom as bikes have widely been considered essential services, or bike shops have been considered essential service providers around the country, to where now roughly 90% of bicycle dealerships in the US are operating in some way. Some of that is just pickup or curb pickup for repair or new bike purchases. So there's good news for the use of bikes around the country. We've seen more and more people riding and more people interested about repairing their old bikes and getting kids on bikes, which we see cities now closing streets to automobile traffic to give more space for bicycles and pedestrians to move about freely and social distance. And so that's encouraging, and that could certainly lead to more opportunities for bicycles and e-bikes, especially in this delivery space as things change. still we have a lot of questions about purchasing power and employment for everybody going forward, and what that overall impact on the market could mean for transitions and developments like this to continue. So we're cautious, somewhat optimistic though. And some really cool things that have come up about it are people using e-bikes to deliver supplies, emergency supplies, or essential goods. People using e-bikes to deliver school lunches to kids in communities, and cities making bikes or e-bikes available to essential workers. And so we're seeing that e-bikes are able to pick up some of the slack from where public transportation is maybe a bit limited in this time. And we'll see how that goes. We're not hoping for an end of public transportation, but are encouraged to see that micromobility in its various forms has been able to be a help in this situation.
I'll jump in next. So a lot of the problems that we have been running into, a lot of them are probably a little bit unique compared to the rest of the panel, just due to us being still more of a startup and startup problems. But a lot of it has to do with really understanding where delivery and shared mobility is going to go afterwards, and making the decisions now to accommodate, the future of the world, I guess, after COVID. With launching a locker right before COVID, we've been flooded with an influx of random inquiries in different types of applications, from sharing and providing access to cleaning equipment at apartments, to accommodating restaurants, restaurateurs connecting with food delivery services like Uber Eats and DoorDash and those companies, to reduce the amount of traffic in the restaurants. But all of that takes manpower and development, especially on a software side for us. And so identifying which applications are going to be used well beyond COVID, and that's probably what we're all dwelling on a daily basis. But obviously as a younger company, it's even probably so much more vital. We've really been looking at what applications are creating efficiencies and value, visualizing it in just an average, quote unquote, average world, and not necessarily the COVID world, and not chasing all of the COVID requests or applications, because some of them, might not be relevant in the next, even 4, 6, 10 months. So that's been our biggest challenge, is focusing the team on the long-term visions and features and applications of our products. So it's kind of internally, that's what we've been focusing on.
Cool. And so, kind of broadly speaking, challenges and opportunities from the public sector side, I think there's, we spoke about it a little bit, but the interesting opportunity to connect this sort of myopic focus that's been around for 100 years on people mobility, and think of all the mind share that we've put towards creating efficiencies in moving people through transit, through shared mobility and new models, but really over the last 100 years. And so just sort of baby stepping DOTs and cities into putting some of that mind share on how do we create efficiencies in the larger freight ecosystem and network, which is, as Samir kind of mentioned, potentially more complex. There's many more brokers and players. There's much more kind of land use intersection when you think about warehousing, distribution centers, and how many people may touch an item, for example, from its production in China, say, till it gets to your doorstep in the cardboard box. It's gone through many more touch points, right, than maybe you getting on the bus in the morning. So I think that's what's exciting and challenging, is how do we bring more of that attention and just kind of mind space and thinking to this space in the public sector. Again, learning what's happening. There's been a lot of innovation in the last 10 years or so in the freight space with models like the Uber Freight, Convoy, others, and just how much e-commerce has driven a lot of that innovation. And so that's what's exciting to me is I love talking about freight. I love learning about it and seeing what companies are doing and how they're bringing new innovations to the space. And so how do we start to infuse that into the way kind of public sector leaders and regulators think about this, again, with an eye towards efficiency and carbon reduction, right? And then another thing that's exciting to think about, also challenging, is again, how do we broaden, a lot of what we do is thinking kind of about the public right of way. And that's super important. We need to talk about curb, we need to talk about sidewalks, and we'll do that more on this panel. But also, how do we think more holistically about these networks? And it starts with an understanding of them, but then what are the opportunities for kind of government intervention, support, incentives around increasing that efficiency? And so that is where you think about land use, the hub project that Andisha mentioned. We talk, for example, a lot about shared mobility hubs in the public space, and that's a very hot topic and has been, thinking about how do we bring, bikes and scooters and make parking around a transit center. But we don't often incorporate freight, and we don't often think about that in the same way and put the same attention to that. And so that's where I get really excited about, okay, we're already kind of close. We're talking about a lot of the same ideas, but we need to, broaden that tent a bit and include freight. And so they're both challenges and opportunities. And then the last thing I'll say is, again, this group, this larger shared mobility space talks about transportation demand management, TDM, a lot. And that really goes back to behavior, consumer choices and behavior changes. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in the public space to bring more education towards consumer choices around delivery, e-commerce, especially in the climate trade-off. There's just not a lot of information out there for people to make those informed choices. Is it more efficient to order your groceries by delivery? And I think, I don't know the answer. There still needs to be more research done, but that is a space I see where the public sector could play a bigger role, which we've been helping people make those choices around people mobility for a long time. So how do we bring that lens to freight?
Awesome. Yeah, there's a lot of exciting things that we can talk about, innovations, opportunities, and stuff. And we're going to talk about the future of this field in a couple of minutes. But for now, I want to ask our panels to address the question that I know everyone has been looking to, and it's on everyone's mind with this pandemic. So the impacts and responses to COVID. So tell us about how this pandemic has affected your work, your market, and how you have been adapting to it. What were some of the unexpected challenges, and also maybe some of the unexpected benefits that you experienced? And what strategies have you relied on to maintain operations? And also, what are the biggest risks that you see for the field of supply chain in a COVID era? Samir, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, sure. So this has been a pretty unprecedented situation. I mean, something that only a global pandemic can really create. We were talking about this internally the other day, but nobody could think of an event that impacted every single industry indiscriminately, every single geography around the world pretty much indiscriminately. And so, as you would expect, it's impacted everything. And if I think about different stakeholders within sort of our ecosystem, we can talk about each of those. So on the shipper side, and where people who are interested in moving goods, it has really, we've seen a significant slowdown in just overall demand in the market. And we saw some initial spikes in the areas you might expect, some food and beverage, CPG, medical supplies, with the early sort of rush, and we were able to support that. But even those have started to come down now, and we've really started to see a real just depression of demand. And so in terms of challenges, that's an obvious challenge for us in just being able to run a successful business. And so a lot of what we think about there is how do we think about what our shippers need right now, and how do we make sure we're supporting them through this challenging time, but also where do we think there are going to be green shoots in the economy? Where do we think that we'll see certain companies or industries emerge, and how do we make sure that we're supporting them in the right way? On the carrier side and the driver side, the market has really softened, as you might expect, and it's a direct correlation to the demand. And so, a lot of there's two things we kind of think about on the driver side. One is, how do we make sure that we're providing them opportunities and they still have the chance to utilize their assets and make a living? And the second piece is, how do we make sure that they stay safe through these times? And that's a combination of a lot of different things, right? So one of the things we've done is give all of our drivers Uber Eats credits, because a lot of restaurants are shut down, on the road. And so making sure they have access to warm meals is really critical. We've also sent them packages with medical goods to just make sure they're being safe on the road. We've invested in things like electronic bill of ladings and things like that to try and make sure we're making things as touchless as possible at facilities. We've worked really closely with those facilities to flag instances where there has been a case of COVID, to make sure that we're messaging that to our carriers and communicating that. And so that has been a significant shift and frankly, a real challenge, because there just hasn't been the infrastructure built around solving for a lot of these problems. And then the last point I'll bring up is, our internal operations teams and our internal teams have seen a significant impact too. We've seen parts of the business that have really slowed or completely stalled. And ride sharing is a very good example. As cities have shut down, so has ride sharing. Bikes and scooters has slowed down significantly. On the flip side, we've seen quite a bit of an increase in our Eats business and our freight business. And so how do we marshal folks to make sure that we're supporting the areas where we see a surge, training and developing and getting people to the right areas, where we have distributed operations in certain countries that are more impacted or less impacted? How do we make sure in real time we're leveraging the folks who have availability and who want to help, and also make sure we're supporting folks who are impacted personally and professionally, to make sure that we're doing the right thing for them. The reality is, in summary, it just touches everything, and it's been a real challenge. And I'm sure you're going to hear this from other folks, but the biggest challenge, the overarching macro challenge, is nobody knows when this is going to end, what's going to happen, and how we respond to this. And so this is a bit of sort of being in a dark room and just kind of feeling 6 inches in front of you, because there's no precedent, there's no ability to kind of lean on previous things. So that's a quick summary on my end, and happy to jump in more as people share more perspective.
Stephen, do you want to go next?
Yeah, just a couple things that we're doing differently with this. It's one is we work a lot with dealers on training staff on e-bike technology and how to operate the systems and do maintenance on the systems. And that's something that we're not able to do. We're not able to visit shops, or we're certainly not sending people to shops to do this. So we are developing more online tools for educating bike shops and bike industry workers on how to operate these systems and maintain these systems. That's certainly one change for us. The other has just been trying to be creative, find as many ways possible where e-bikes can be a solution in this situation, and working with groups that are interested in doing the same. So that's been, normally we spend our summer at big bike events and bike festivals and bike races, and we've had to sort of change what we're doing right now and what we're thinking about, which has some benefits. It's forced us to put a bit more of our energy into solving some more serious problems, and that's not all bad.
Great. What about you, Brian? What about Koloni?
Yeah, so I think over the last few weeks, it's actually been getting more difficult to manage. Having hardware, shareable hardware, whether it's bikes, e-bikes, or lockers in the public domain, it's and kind of scattered around the United States. It's been really hard to manage those local relationships and understand what each state is doing. And with what each state is doing, because they're doing it differently, it's created different types of expectations for everybody. And that's made it very, very difficult that a partner in Iowa might think that they're ready to go because their governor says that they're ready to go, when it might be completely different here in Illinois. So I think this is going to continue to be really difficult from a management standpoint of having these different systems throughout the country, is working with those city officials and having a game plan for each one of them that's maybe not necessarily unique all the way through, but there's things you're going to obviously want to duplicate as a company from one instance to another. The other thing from a hardware standpoint is making our products safe, right? Obviously, we can implement sanitation guidelines for all of our operations teams, whether we're operating it or our partners operating it. But having access to some of those products can be difficult. And then also, answering all the questions that some of our partners might have. Wheels came out with antiseptic hand grips, and they're asking, why can't we have those? And all these things become, extremely difficult to manage because of everyone's expectations, and are becoming more and more fragmented, I'm afraid, which again, I think that's going to be the most difficult part. Honestly, up until this point, it has been, I wouldn't say easy, but like Stephen said, we've been able to really focus internally on product, both software and hardware, and really kind of put ourselves in this bubble and really focus internally on getting some projects done that we want to get done. But now that things are starting to open up, it'll continue to be challenging, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think for those that are here watching that work in the public space, I think there's been an interesting opportunity where you have this sort of cataclysmic event, and cities and states and governments have had to react very quickly and move very fast, which if you work in government, that we work hard, but we maybe aren't always working on the super fast timeline that we see in the private sector. So I think that's been I think that's an opportunity for cities and governments to see that you can move really fast and still deliver quality products with them. There may be some risks, but you can deliver good services and implement new projects on a very tight timeline. So one example of that here in the city of Seattle from our Curb team, they worked very quickly responding to both local restaurants and also citizens, and sort of using our own data tools that we have to deploy over 400 temporary passenger load zones, which are 3-minute loading areas that can be used for both TNCs or anyone stopping, as well as food delivery. And so the idea was, we need to facilitate a more seamless, easier experience where we have all these restaurants doing takeout now that wasn't happening before. And so they were able to, with using A-frames and sort of scrappy guerrilla tactics, new signage, deploy crews out and get hundreds of these deployed very, very quickly, again, to facilitate both the economic side of the restaurants as well as sort of the traffic mitigation. So I think that's a great example of moving really fast and not needing to go through millions of rounds of approvals. And my hope is that we can, governments can use this as an opportunity to see that you can do fast flight pilots and projects, and sort of try to keep pace with things that are happening. It also highlights the need for governments to be agile, because things happen and we need to be able to move very quickly to test something, to try something out, to fix something in our public spaces. And then on the supply chain piece, I think I came out of the waste world originally, and waste is one of those great examples where everyone produces it and everyone throws it out and pays their garbage bill, but you never really think about it. You don't spend a lot of time thinking about waste. And I kind of equate freight to that. We don't often think about our supply chain and how even our groceries get to the grocery store. It's just sort of something we take for granted. And so again, my hope is that this whole pandemic really highlights what is essential, and sort of how that is part of our lives, and having people think a little bit more about where things come from and how things are moving, and what it really takes kind of for us to survive. And I think that to me is really interesting, and something that, how does the government and the public sector and cities, again, think more about supply chains and maybe just help understand them better, and how we can facilitate a more efficient experience there.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and what Kelly was talking about at the end makes a great segue to my next question. So in every crisis, there are lessons to be learned, and there are some positive aspects as well that could stay. And there was also earlier, there was a question from the audience that what are the things that you have implemented during this time that might have legs actually to stay beyond COVID? So I want to ask any of you who, some of you mentioned this in your talk before, but if you have any additional thought that you want to offer on the lessons learned from the COVID era, and things that may stay with you post this pandemic and may change the way that you manage operation or work as the threat for COVID gets smaller. Anyone wants to volunteer, talk about that?
Sure. I would just say, things that have changed is, of course, I'm coming from the bicycle side, but that people are using bicycles for trips and things that they didn't before. And so a hope is that with this change, and as things return to more normal, let's say, that will stick a bit, that this bike use will become more permanent, that people will replace car trips or use bicycles for getting around more and for more recreation as well. So that's something we're trying to help stick, let's say.
Kelly, I'm going to put you on the spot again. You mentioned some of the changes that the city is doing, and there's a lot going on in the city of Seattle, at least, and also in other cities that I keep reading about, like in San Francisco and Washington, D.C. Are there some of the changes that the city of Seattle is doing right now? Do you expect some of them to stay for longer term, and maybe some of them just create new opportunities for new innovations?
Yeah, I think the example I gave with the passenger load zones, those are temporary now, but we fully intend to work with our private partners and get feedback from both restaurants and our delivery companies to understand, where can we make these permanent? Where is this adding value add and creating better efficiency at the curb? And so that's already on the work plan. I think, other opportunities, as we've mentioned, just better incorporating freight into planning in general. And I think something we're all confronting now is this uptick in e-commerce, and we mentioned earlier, but I think traffic isn't an issue now, right? And so we're seeing cities experiment with things like safe streets or slow streets all over the country. I think to some of the early points about biking, that is an interesting opportunity to show just different ways to utilize the space and potentially promote different ways of delivery or just transporting people. And also how cities think about, as we come out of this curve, right, it's going to be slow, but as our traffic ramps back up and our congestion returns, what are these trends from COVID that are people's e-commerce purchasing patterns going to stay elevated? Are people going to continue to order grocery delivery that they've been doing now that maybe they weren't doing before? And then how does that impact how we do planning and traffic planning, congestion planning, mitigation, and curb management, and sort of larger land use design planning? Again, we don't know the answer, but those are all things that we're going to have to think about more as we move forward, because my feeling is that we will see persistent elevation in people's, we will see persistent changes in purchasing patterns and the way people procure goods. out of this pandemic and knowing that it's not going to be a return to normal in a month. It's going to sort of have, behavior changes become more imprinted the longer you do them, right? And so if this continues for quite a long time, we expect those trends to be very persistent. So we have to be able to react.
And just to maybe build on a point or two Kelly made, I think, at Uber, we, for example, we've obviously seen a significant uptick in food delivery. And I think we very much expect that trend to continue. For how long? Unclear. It could be for 6 months, 12 months. It could be that we've seen a whole new segment of consumers enter the space that are now going to build a habit around it or enjoy this. And so I think that's a good example. I think in the ride side, we've had discussions about how we can make sure that we have longer term policies in place to make people feel safer and to actually create a safer environment. So for example, ensuring that we have all kinds of telematics data on whether drivers are speeding and making sure that they're not using herky-jerky braking motions, but are there things we can do to ensure that drivers are wearing masks and passengers are wearing masks and that they're treating each other in a way that nobody really cared about 6 months ago, but that we will continue to care about in the months and years to come. So I do think you're going to see some fundamental differences there, and I think it'll be dependent a lot on the businesses. I think, like I said, in freight, we're seeing a lot of exploration of more touchless models at facilities, at pickup drop-off points, at nodes in the supply chain to try and really minimize physical contact. And these are things that aren't impossible to solve. There's things that the industry really hasn't had a lot of reason or incentive to solve in the past. And so, sometimes crises like this are, do push along innovation in some ways. So those are a couple examples across Uber. And then the last point I'll make is I do think we'll see a fundamental shift, and I think we're seeing it within Uber in just how we work within our internal teams. And obviously, we talk a lot about this a lot, but we had a lot of jobs that we were pretty certain could not be done remotely. And we found pretty quickly that turns out you can do a lot of these jobs remotely, and we can find new ways to work and interact with each other. And that opens up a whole slew of second and third order opportunities for us as individuals. And so I think that'll be a really interesting piece of this as we come out of it, to see how that evolves and manifests in just how we all are working day to day.
Yeah, and to some of Kelly's points as well, what we're looking at and what I'm really high up on is lockers in the public domain on curbs, and especially in commercial districts for restaurants and retail brick and mortar, mainly because we're going to have the infrastructure needed in case this ever happens again, even if we have a second wave of COVID. But we're going to really having the lockers in the public domain is going to be the only way that retail, brick and mortar, and restaurants are going to be able to reduce the amount of people interacting with that product, and also creating efficiencies for those delivery drivers like Uber Eats and DoorDash. But I'm also really big up personally on when it comes to e-commerce, marketplaces, whether it's Facebook marketplaces or even Etsy or any of these other marketplaces, mainly because I do believe we're going to be, as it looks right now, we're going to be in some form of a recession for the next, whether it's 12, 18, or 24 months or even longer, that people's buying habits are going to change. And I don't think we're going to see in the next handful of months people buying so much, even on Amazon and some of these other online retail stores, and they're going to be looking more locally and maybe secondhand goods and stuff on access on these local marketplaces, where maybe peer-to-peer delivery can be something that's going to be even more prevalent. My wife just went into the city to buy a lamp from somebody the other day, and it became this really awkward interaction of how to access the lamp that she bought from somebody off of Facebook Marketplace. Not be too close to each other. So I think there's going to be some things that are going to be also peer-to-peer in a sense when it comes to delivery in the city.
Wonderful. And so I also want to, so we have been talking about a lot of innovations as we were talking about different things. We mentioned about the future and innovations and also collaboration. So tell me how the future of this field looks to you in terms of the innovations. Like we have companies like Kroger who are doing driverless deliveries. We have companies who are investing in drone deliveries. We have robots. So we have all of these innovations going on. We obviously need a lot of data to address a lot of things that we don't know. So there are a lot of gaps here. And we also need to work together, like all the public, private, and research sectors, they all need to come together and work. So tell me, what are the gaps and also what are the opportunities that you see for the future and how we can all make it work and work together to have a better and more efficient and more sustainable future?
I'm happy to start. So I'll speak a little to specifically freight, since I know there's a lot of experts on this call and in other areas, but I think of it in more like short, medium term and long term. And I think, we spend a lot of time talking about autonomous vehicles, and I do think that's a bet that will manifest itself. At freight, we talk a lot about first mile, last mile with drivers, and then making sure that we have hubs that can go long haul across countries and things like that autonomously. Largely the technology is there. There's some edge cases and and other blockers that don't allow us to do that as much as we'd like. But being able to take 3,000-mile freeway drives autonomously is actually something that has largely been solved technologically. So that's something that I think we're all really excited about longer term. I think some of the things that are maybe less, that get less press, but are equally exciting to me in this space. And there's actually a question about this is, how do we just really create an efficient system that reduces deadhead and make sure that we're making the most of people's time and efforts? And I think, this ties to climate, this ties to people's livelihood, this ties to efficiency in the supply chain. And this is something we think a lot about at Uber Freight. And so everything from, building our carrier app and making sure a driver can pick up their phone and just see, they can see, for example, where the nearest load that they can pick up that has the minimum number of dead miles to pick up, right? And being able to see that super transparently and clearly in any point is incredibly important. But we've also started to, now that we have much more data and have much more visibility in our broader supply chain, we're able to launch things like we've just recently started launching what we call bundles. So a driver can go from city A to city B to city C to back to city A with 0 dead miles or minimizing dead miles throughout that process. And historically, this has just been a really, really significant pain point. And when you're trying to optimize across a supply chain as large and complicated as even just the US for trucking, this takes significant iteration and cycles. But these are the kinds of things that I'm really excited about. And I think, you're going to see not just from Uber Freight, but from a lot of different players in this space, a lot of movement towards these types of improvements as we move towards this longer vision of, autonomous vehicles and some other things. So these are some of the things I'm really excited about in the short term.
So what about you, Kelly? So there is obviously a lot of things going on, and cities have to deal with a lot of new services and regulations and politics. So how do you see cities work in this space with the future that we have ahead of us?
Yeah, I'll mirror some of what Samir said, but it's not lost on me that the autonomy kind of space more broadly had been a little bit struggling, right, to sort of gain traction and really accelerate things like personal delivery devices, the little delivery Roombas that you've sort of heard about, or Neuro with their driverless grocery delivery and things like that. And now we have a pandemic where all of a sudden contactless delivery is a thing that everyone wants. And so I think that will be interesting to see how that plays out. I don't know if that's the gasoline that it needed, but it's certainly a very pertinent use case. So I think it's making cities and states need to reconsider maybe a little bit on that timeline of autonomy more broadly and sort of where the regulation lies. That's something that's kind of on my mind. Data, we talked about that, data gaps. Freight is long haul is heavily regulated, it's heavy haul, but kind of everything beneath that is essentially unregulated. And there's very little visibility and transparency into what happens in that space and how those networks and supply chains really operate. To the point about deadheading and inefficiencies, we have very limited visibility there. So I'd like to think coming out of this, where freight has sort of become the golden child, so to speak, we can maybe partner better with private sector to really get more data and understand what's happening so that we can both facilitate and kind of grease the wheels on some things with incentives and projects and things like hubs and even government land and giving preferential treatment or different things to increase those efficiencies, as well as how do we understand how big that piece of the pie is so that we can craft good regulations and drive the market towards cleaner fuels, cleaner modes, things like bikes, but also electric vehicles, electric vans, electric cars, and the broader efficiency in the network, I think is something that government needs data to do and make decisions about, but we obviously want to work together with our private partners to do something that it's kind of a win-win-win, even though we might have to bring the stick out a little bit to sort of drive towards some of those carbon reduction sustainability metrics.
Stephen and Brian, do you have any thoughts to offer on that?
Yeah, I just said where cities now have the opportunity to rethink how space is used, and as there's it is an opportunity for infrastructure. And not just building bike lanes and things like that, but even just the establishment of these light delivery hubs will make a huge difference. And I think that's a big step that we need cities to take serious. It's just looking for ways to make that happen, that your big trucks can meet up someplace and easily transfer goods to lighter delivery vehicles to make that last, to do that inner or urban center delivery work. That I don't know, it's a great opportunity to do it right now, where we've got the power to make some changes, or good timing to make some changes.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I think what's going to be really fascinating is how many people continue staying at home when they work. And that's obviously really going to change, especially the last 50 feet or 100 feet of delivery. Are you delivering to someone's work or a traditional office, or are you delivering to their house? I think it's going to be really fascinating to see if if people are wanting more instant on-demand deliveries when they're sitting at home working, or if they want to get out of the house and go do those things that maybe they were having Instacart or some of these other delivery services do prior to COVID. So I think the working from home component is going to be something that, the news isn't talking about it enough, but I think it's going to be a big disruptor in terms of how we move. And it's probably, in terms of the infrastructure that we might think we need now, that the city should be designing, it might be completely different. There might be parks, outdoor parks that people are working at collectively. I mean, who knows? I think it can be a really interesting time when we come out of this COVID and people start working from home, but they can move freely. I think that's gonna be really fascinating.
Wonderful. I've been trying to combine some of the questions that we get from the audience with some of the questions that I had. So right now I'm looking through the list to see if there are any questions that we haven't addressed in our discussion. And I see one here that it might be for you, Samir, that they're asking, there's a lot of public attention on safety and economic issues for on-demand delivery workers right now. What opportunities and challenges do you see to help support that workforce and align mobility planning and operation goals with that?
Yeah, so I think this is what I would consider more of an existential question that the gig economy has, has had to think about for a really long time. And I think it's exacerbated by a situation like this. So I think there's several things, right? The first thing that we're doing at Uber around this is, as we think about how the situation can impact our drivers, our couriers, our carriers across the board, we're really trying to make sure that we're creating the right opportunities and incentives for them to still be safe, right? So I mentioned earlier, we cover a lot of the healthcare costs for drivers who are, so a driver, for example, on our platform that gets a case of COVID, we cover them for 2 weeks and their pay completely, just to make sure that they have time to recover and they don't lose their livelihood. We send warm meals to our drivers on the road. We've also opened up, we've done a couple different things to just make sure our drivers and couriers have the opportunities to stay busy. So we've, for example, opened up a platform on Uber that not only allows our drivers and our couriers and our carriers to cross-train and work across our business lines, but also it's basically a job platform for other businesses outside of Uber that need help and need workers. And so a big part of it is making sure that we're finding them opportunities to continue to have a livelihood while our business, different elements of our business decline. So it's a really challenging question. And we're all kind of navigating it together. But the overarching goal is to just try and do the right thing, both from an economic perspective and from a safety perspective for our partners.
And how do you navigate the politics around different carriers, Samir? That's also another question specifically for you.
Yeah, I saw this question. I'm not totally sure I understand it.
All right. Well, if you can provide more, whoever asked this question, if you can provide more input and Samir can answer you in the chat box. I think we have almost answered all of the questions. There was one question about curb, specifically for me and Kelly, about drivers, Uber and Lyft drivers sitting in the freight load zones and occupying that. How can we solve that? So that's actually a tough, I'm going to take a shot and answer that one. That's actually not easy to solve that problem. So it's not something that just relates to the lack of space or the regulations or something. So in a study that we did earlier, and Kelly referred to that, so we provided a ton of new passenger load zones for Uber and Lyft drivers to see if the problem was just the lack of space. But it alleviated the situation a little bit, but we also saw that for about 7 to 10% of the drivers would still stop somewhere that is not a passenger load zone, regardless of where there was a space or not. And that, I think, is it's different from place to place, and it's also different because of the way that TNCs and freights operate. Like a TNC, it's a very short stop. It's like a matter of seconds. But for delivery vehicles, they have to stop there at the curb and they have to find somewhere to actually do their work. So it's a combination of providing space as needed, dynamically manage the curbs. That's something that all of the cities are doing right now, and also getting more information, which can be answered by data. So knowing better how each like TNCs, bikes, and delivery vehicles, how much are they using the curb, so that we can manage that space better. I don't see any, so I think we answered almost all of the questions and we are right on time. So any final thought that you want to add, maybe briefly, just 20 seconds or so, if any of our panelists want to offer any thought, and then I'm going to pass it on to Rudy. All right.
Thank you.
Well,
thank you for facilitating and moderating this. This was great.
Yeah,
thank you all
Yes,
for your
thank you very
time.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you again, Rudy, for putting this panel together. And thank you to all of our panelists for taking the time to be with us today. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I hope that was the same for our audience as well.